Alright, for something completely different, I thought I'd put together a video of replacing the clutch on my Komatsu D20P-6A. I've actually already completely disassembled the clutch, and I've got the new clutch plates, and so I'm really going to just be showing how to put it back together, but that will give you the same thing, just do everything in reverse, essentially, to disassemble. And I'll talk about it as I go along. Now, like I say, this is an old Komatsu that I picked up at an auction. It was actually one of the steering clutches didn't work, so I had taken that apart when I first got it and broke it all loose. The clutch plates were still decent, so now that steering actually works better than the other side, which one of these days I'll probably have to get into and clean up. But the problem I was running into was that the clutch, if I got into a situation where, I was on an incline or something, unless I revved high, the clutch was slipping. So I was like, well, assume it's worn out. And sure enough, I got into it, and that's what I saw. Now, here's the plate on mine. As you can see, it says D20P-6 dot. I've gone back and forth in catalogs and talking to different people, and that dot apparently refers to A in my case because I do have the full tilt blade, etc. I'm guessing this may have been a very early version of the 6A, but I don't know. But basically for mine, everything I've done with fixing cylinders and stuff have all required 6A parts, not 6. But for the most part, the clutch is going to be the same in all of them, and so we'll go through that process and let you see what we've got. Now, what I did to be able to work on this is basically dug myself a trench and piled the rock up, nice rocky ground so that it's solid, piled up on either side, and basically just straddled the trench with the bulldozer so that I've got plenty of room to get under it and work. Now, I'd done the same thing, just happened to have a trench I was working on at the time when I got this and needed to change all the fluids in it, and that worked really well. I decided to go a little bigger here and kind of hit a point where I was mixed. I should have either gone deeper or not as deep, because laying down in the trench, I can't reach anything, but it's not tall enough to stand up, so the end result is that I'm sitting there trying to either kneel or sit up in there to work, and that's just, for a guy my size, was a little inconvenient. Now, first thing you remove off the bottom with 6 big bolts in there that are fun to break loose is this big bottom tray. You'll notice there's actually an opening. That's where, when you're draining the oil, you just take that cover off, which I had done previously, and have it sitting over here on the tracks buried somewhere. Off the top, you have this is actually something they put together. Apparently the one originally on there probably rusted out or something, but that covers this opening and protects all of the hydraulic lines and stuff above everything. And of course, normally looking down through there, what you would see is the clutch housing and the this universal joint that connects the two. So removing that universal joint gives you the room, along with the fact that this remaining side, you can see I put the bolts back in, that remaining part of the mount for the universal joint is on a spline shaft, so it can move back. Once you move that back, you've got enough room to pull the whole housing out and then get to the clutch. Now, what you're probably seeing down in there, seeing two interesting things. First off, in order to loosen up that spring, you work with what you got handy at the time, and sticks were laying around. It was a little hard for me to find a good point to push or pull and grab to stretch that spring out. So I spread it out one loop at a time just to make it a little looser. That's the tension spring for the clutch pedal here. And we'll reverse that and take all of those sticks out when we put it together. They've been a little bit in the way, at least visually. You'll notice I've got all the bolts on the clutch plate and housing. They're all back in place just to save them. And in the middle, you can see the little 3D printed part that I created to actually, there's a tool that you need to align the clutch plates so that when you go and you first clamp this thing down, they'll be centered on the spline that's going to come in off of the external housing. So I went ahead and printed my own. Looks like it's going to work quite nicely, and if somebody needs one, you'll be able to contact me through this post, and I can see about getting you one. Okay, so let's get underneath and take a closer look. So before I go crawling underneath, I wanted to show you, this is the actual housing for the clutch assembly. And so what you have here, these two linkages go to to a branch point and basically tie to the clutch pedal. That's where the spring would be. And so this shifts the throwout bearing internally, and it also controls, you'll notice I actually had to disconnect it because in order to get to some of the fittings it was in the way, but it controls your brake that actually puts the brake on the drive shaft. You can see where the universal joint mounted, and then you've got hydraulics coming in and going out for the rear steering. And there's something going toward the front. I'm not 100% sure what that drives, whether this hydraulic also drives the lift on the blade. What you have here, this under here is the pump, your drain, which of course would be at the bottom if I oriented this way. And under here, I've actually got this loose, and the screen is out because I got to clean it. And of course, I'm going to clean inside all these parts. But this is the screen for the hydraulic fluid going into the pump. And I already removed and cleaned that when I first got this thing at auction. And the screen doesn't look to be in perfect shape, but it works well enough, and it's already pretty gunked up again just from the residual. The fluid coming out was pretty clean from what I had put in previously, but there was still residual that came through. So that's the outside. I'll show you the inside later when I start working on it. But gives you a starting point. Of course, you can also see the fluid fill tube there. Now, real quickly in terms of disassembly, you'll see this when I go to put it back on. The instructions, if you get the Komatsu service book, it's not very detailed, but what it says is, you take this off and then you're supposed to put some eye bolts in here to have lift points. I just got some strapping and ended up needing to add the front lift point simply because in order to get it far enough back and clear all those hydraulics, you really need to be catching it from up here. So I switched partway through. And frankly, I'm just going to leave those on there. There's no reason to take them off. They're not in the way of anything. They don't look pretty, but should I ever need to get back into this, they'll be there. They'll probably have rusted off by then, but who knows. Here we are down underneath the tractor and, of course, the bulldozer. And one of the downsides of this trench thing, of course, is having the rock caving in on you constantly. And more importantly, depending on how long it takes you to get all this done, having a bunch of rain come in and make everything wet every time you turn around. Not to mention the oil dripping and whatever else. So, new piece of cardboard to try to keep it clean for just a little while longer, although it's already got dirt and dust falling on it. But for the most part, this will work. So here now you can see a little closer. You can see there's the actual flywheel gear for the starter. And again, my little adapter, which I'm going to have to pull out for the moment because I'm going to clean all this up a little before I close it up. The other thing, I still got to clean a little bit of gasket off. You can see right there. And then just try to clean this entire surface. One thing on the gasket material, I am not going to try to put a new gasket on. The aftermarket stuff for this is absurd. So I'm just going to use silicone. And I meant to get new O-rings for everything because these are pretty flat, but of course I forgot, ran out of time, whatever you want to say. And so I'm going to hope that those are going to hold if I get them clean. And if it happens to leak, I'll be back in here pulling O-rings and trying not to lose too much oil in the process. So before I go crawling up under there with all of this, I thought I would show you the clutch assembly. And as far as I know, I've got this in the same way I pulled it off. You'll notice this used to have a label that I believe said front side, and it's now missing, worn off with the oil. So this is the front clutch plate. You can see about how thick it is and how little material is left. Luckily it was not metal to metal yet. Then you have the inner pressure plate. So this is the dividing plate, and you'll see how these parts go up into a slot in the housing on the flywheel. Then we have the second plate. The one thing to note here are, I believe in both cases, the way this works is that the big head of the rivets faces towards the flywheel, and the spline, the extended portion of the spline in both cases extends away from that center plate. So hopefully that's the case. And again, some labeling I can't read, but I'm assuming that that said backside, I hope. Again, looking at the Komatsu drawing, it's not totally clear, but I'm pretty sure this is the case. Then we have the actual clutch assembly, with these actually drive the throwout bearing, or are driven by the throwout bearing, I should say, to pull back this plate. Now, in order to get this off without it all blowing up, you actually have to add some bolts in here. And you'll notice, I'll show you when I pull them out, I think these I ended up with 150, and you want the washers to keep from buggering this thing up too badly. But you screw those in, but you can't screw them too far or you'll hit the plate, right? So there's a limit to how far those screws can go. So you need a nut to be able to, once you get the bolt into the plate, you use the nut to actually pull it back and compress that spring all the way around. And other features, this gear actually is going to drive, when we put that housing, you'll see underneath there, there's actually a gear that meshes with this that drives the pump. So this is the pump drive for the fluid. Now the one other thing I got, I don't know if I will need it at all, but I went ahead and I made myself a little spacer here that goes in and fits that spline. This is actually one that was a little too short, but a little tight fit. The other one's a little better. But basically the idea is that would be able to fit on the back of that spline and make sure everything's perfectly aligned before I release this. Because what's going to happen is the instant you release these, that center clutch plates, these plates are going to stay exactly where they're at. They're not going anywhere. So if you don't have those aligned properly, there is no way you're getting the new spline shaft, or the spline shaft that's in that housing, back down into this. Now, take a quick look here. And of course, I'm not happy I'm getting dirty oil all over this because I don't want any grit. But here's the new plate versus the old. And we'll try to get these side by side to give you a little bit of an idea of just how much material you have. Now, you know, I would have liked to have seen these things a little thicker than this, but certainly it's got quite a bit of life compared to where we're at. So you can definitely tell we were worn out, and now we'll have a new clutch plate. So with that, I'm going to get underneath, finish cleaning up and pulling all the bolts, getting them out of the way so that I can come and start mounting this housing. Okay, so here we are now after having cleaned up all of the gasket material off of here and cleaning all the remaining dirty oil out of the bottom of that. Looks like there might still be a spot or two in the corner. I should get some dirt. The one thing to remember on this gasket, it is still, even though they had gasket material, they still call out using a layer of silicone to glue it into place. So you still need to very carefully, smoothly scrape that off. But now we're pretty well clean, and I'm ready to put that center shaft back in and start see about reassembling this thing. So after cleaning off the clutch plate assemblies, just to remove a little bit of oil and any of the dirt and dust that might be on it, as well as all of the nuts or bolts that were in there that hold it, I'm ready to go start assembling this whole thing. The one thing I wanted to show you, and you'll see this when these go on, these shoulder bolts go in the middle hole here of each of these assemblies, and so presumably this is going to be sufficient to get those exactly where they belong, but we will see for sure. Alright, so now we're about ready to do this. Got my little center shaft in there. I was a little concerned that that gear was binding up, so I cleaned it a little more. Or not gear, the bearing. So hopefully got most of the trash out of it, but it should do okay once it's lubricated again. And we've got our plates and the clutch parts, and we're gonna put them on one at a time and see where we end up. So if I have all the guidance and directions correct, the first plate goes on with the long part of the spline towards the flywheel, as well as the large heads of the rivets. The small heads and the ring that hold that whole thing on are on the back side. It seems to fit. And so next we put the second plate on, or the intervening plate here. That's too heavy for me to try to do one-handed, so I got to pause again. And when inserted, as you can see, those portions go in. And now we have our outer clutch plate. You'll notice that the long part of the spline now has, again, the short or smaller rivet heads, large rivet heads to the inside. And so I should be able to just slide this right on my tool, and there we have a pair of nicely aligned clutch plates. And now we get the big, heavy job of putting this on. And we will come back once we got some bolts in it. Alright, so I now have these bolts finger tight, but you'll notice that they're essentially bottomed out, which, if I can get you that shot. So they're essentially bottomed out, so that shoulder is now controlling the spacing. And you can see that the other bolt holes here pretty much are straight on in, so that should be nicely centered. The one thing I had designed to go here to double check this in terms of where the tool is, my tool ended up not being quite long enough. But as best I can tell, that's pretty close to straight. Reality is there's not much I can do about it, but if those holes aren't correct, there's really not much space there anyway. In terms of mounting, using a 17 millimeter for that larger, and most of the bolts that you're dealing with on this are going to be 17 millimeter. These smaller bolts that go to hold everything in are going to be 13s. I don't know if you can see that or not. Let me get some bolts in it, get everything undone, and then we'll release the clutch. All right, so as expected, those side bolts went in very easily. They basically went straight in, and I threaded them all the way in by hand, and then just had to torque everything down. I'll have to look up what the torque specifications are, although I may get my torque wrench out, but frankly, I don't think I can torque them any more than they are. The one thing I was going to show you, though, is just how easy it is to move the flywheel here. So as you're bolting and unbolting, this thing's actually very difficult to torque and untorque. So you've really got to use, what I did was use an extension, and I'm basically forcing the torque solely around the bolt and avoiding turning the whole thing. And so with that, we're now ready to release the clutch. And so what I've got is my 17 millimeter wrench, and I'm basically going to loosen each of these by hand very slowly. The one thing I want to do is make sure that this thing is centered and pushed all the way in so that those clutch plates are as straight as they possibly can be. Again, hopefully they're roughly evenly spaced from those pins. And then I'm going to slowly let that down. I don't want to just unbolt this thing, because if that thing slams against the plates, it could cause damage, but at minimum it'd probably just move them out of place. So let me get it unbolted and we'll come back. So all three bolts are now completely loose, which means we are bottomed out on the clutch plate. Might as well just take these on out. So like I say, that's what I ended up using. This nut, about a 150 millimeter bolt, if it'll focus on it. There you go. 150 millimeter bolt and a nut and washer. And with those all loose, those clutch plates should be completely captured. So that's completely under pressure. And now I just slide my little tool out. And you'll notice the tape, because even though I measured it a couple of times and actually printed a part to try to caliper it, or measured it with calipers and then printed a part that was supposed to fit, I still ended up, when I did this, it ended up being slightly loose. And I'm not sure if that's because I changed printer settings. But there you are. You can see all the way down the shaft. It's all nicely aligned. And as soon as I finish cleaning up the outside edge, put a bead of sealant on this and try to drag that all back up in here, we will finish this assembly. Alright, so here we are, much more cleaned up on the outside, although not completely clean. And probably should have taken a power washer to this even before I took everything off, but so since it's not out here and handy on a regular basis, that just wasn't an option. Here is the interior, and as you can see, there's the gear for the drive pump right there. Obviously, this has had a certain amount of water infiltration, just because you can see the line there. Presumably, the clear line is actually what was underneath the oil, I suspect, and all the rest of that resided above it. And of course, you can see the clutch shaft that actually pushes the throw-out bearing here. And of course, we have not cleaned this side up. Still got to pull the gasket off all the way around, as well as attempting to get all this dirt out of it. So we will take a shot at that and then see about continuing with the assembly of the clutch. Alright, well that's about as cleaned up as I'm going to be able to get that, largely because it is trying to rain on me. But you can see I've got all of the gasket cleaned off, and pretty much cleaned all the trash and dirt out of the inside as best I could. I've also cleaned underneath this cover over here, which is where the filter goes, or screen. I don't actually have the screen in there yet. I'll put that in when I finish up. I do want to clean a couple of these fittings a little more, especially that one, since I don't know what all might have gone down in there. I could unscrew it and try to clean it out, but I think I might grab a Q-tip or something and go in those. But I'm going to go ahead and get it mounted so that I can at least dry this thing in, if you will, and then I can work on the outside connections. So now it's a matter of trying to roll this back underneath there without getting a bunch of dirt and stuff falling in it, and hook it up and pull it up and get it into place. So we'll see how that goes. All right, so I have my continuous, if not very pretty, bead of silicone going all the way around, inside and outside of every hole. And then I've got my strap that I'm going to use to pull the housing up and into place. All right, so here we are hooked and ready to start lifting. I've strapped the hoses up out of the way. And basically the trick is to lift this so that that center shaft clears that piece, and then slide the whole mess straight in. Challenging, definitely, but let's go for it. All right, well, here's where things start to get a little challenging, partly just because I can't pull from the dead center of the support, unless I were to somehow put two straps on here, which could be done. But it's really just a matter of finagling things around, and right now we are slightly hooked underneath that, so I can't free it one-handed. I don't think, well, maybe I can, because I can turn the drive shaft a little bit. There we go. All right, so again, you just barely have enough space to get this between there and to get that to clear that center pin. And I'm going to pull it up about one more stop, and that should let me carefully get the center pin back in the center, because it's probably going to catch on the edge of that gear when I first pull it up. But with a little bit of manhandling to just level out what the lift can't quite do, I'll get that on center. And then the real challenge is going to be get it on center of the clutch plates and slide it in. Once I'm there, the last little bit of distance will be getting the pump to line up with the gear that's on the clutch plate, or clutch housing, I should say. But we're getting close. So crawling back underneath so I can manhandle a little bit. The shaft is now centered, or in the center, but the tension is just slightly too much for me to get that to go where it needs. I gotta drop it just a little bit. One of the challenges as you pull this up is that dipstick, which they don't say to remove, but wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. Actually, I don't know if it's even a dipstick, just the fill tube. That would actually work better if you took that off, just to give you more room to work on that side, because it's got to fit in a specific spot and it gets in the way. So let me go back upstairs, drop this just a touch, and see if I can slip it into the clutch. I have the part in the hole and it's centered, but now I'm back to the same problem that I had on the way down in reverse. And you see I've got two sets of hooks there. That's because in order to swing this thing forward and into that, I'm going to have to lift it from the back side so that it can swing forward. You can see how this hook is in the way now. Like I say, had the exact same problem in reverse. I had to come and add those hooks on the back, or that loop on the back, in order to be able to swing it out because same problem I was hitting over here. So it's a balancing act. So now I get to try to swap this around. Last time it was a little easier because the thing was just stuck, so I could just leave it hanging there while I swapped. Here I'm going to have to support it separately and then swap the connection. Okay, so now we're swapped to the back hook, and we should be able to make it the rest of the way on in. So I'm going to go under, see if I can manhandle it a little bit and get it into place. All right, if you can see here, we now appear to be in the slot, but not straight. So as I lower it a little, this whole thing will hang off of that slot and hopefully just slip right on in, but we will see. And just like that, we're now on the clutch line and can push this on in. So now the only thing is going to be getting on the pump shaft, which may actually require removing those bolts enough that I can rotate back and forth a little bit to get that to align. So we will see. And now we're in contact with our seal and ready to start putting bolts in. All right, so now we have all our bolts in, and you can see some of the silicone squeezing out in a couple of spots. If you read the documentation on the silicone, you'll see this, although they don't really say much about why. But you don't want to just go and put this on and clamp it all the way down with the bolts. You actually want to let the silicone solidify a little bit, so you tighten it down to make a good gasket all the way around and spread out, but then you leave them and potentially only finger tight or just a little more, and once it's cured, then you come back and tighten it down, or at least once it's had an hour or two to set up. And part of the reason for that, it doesn't really tell you that, but if you need to take this thing off, you need a gasket in there. You actually need a gap so that you can get in there and cut it with a knife if you need to, or something else. You need a gap. Without that, you're never getting this thing off. And of course, if it gets too thin, it's always possible that it won't seal either. But more likely, it's just you'll never get the thing back off. So anyway, that is about as far as I'm probably going to get today. I may come back and tighten it down. I've got to start hooking up hoses and things. But since all of those would be in the way of the bolts that hold the flange on until it's cured enough for me to tighten the rest of the way, I can't go put everything else back on. And given that it's 4:30 and I have yet to have lunch, this is where I stop for now. Complete my reassembly of my D20P clutch. Last weekend we had freezing rain and everything was frozen and cold. This weekend, yesterday, we were having record highs, hit 85 out here, 88 or 89 in Austin. Today, it's 39 degrees, so I'm back out here freezing my butt off. So I've got a few things I'm going to need. I've got my cotter pins. I've got an assortment of O-rings, and let's see if we can pop this open and show. Basically, these are metric size. You can see on the top of that post, you can see the one that looks a little square. That's the old one for the hydraulics. Presumably those are the size that I'll need, but we'll double check as we go in. But this gives me a whole collection to work with. Nothing big enough to replace, for example, the O-ring on the this filter here, or screener, but that's okay. Now, I've got this out, I've got to clean it still. Wanted to show, so this is after, when I first got this, I went through and I cleaned it up pretty good. And you can see it's still clear enough, but it's pretty grimy. So this was all the remaining residue, whatever else wore off the clutch for the bit that I've used it, and then just the trash that was in the lines. Now, the fact that we've cleaned this thing out pretty heavily, I expect it to do well going forward. The only thing are the hydraulic lines that I can't necessarily get completely clear without really disassembling things. And unfortunately, the best I could find on finding a replacement for these, they would have been back ordered, and it was over $150. So over 150. The one thing that I think it may just be part of the way it's designed, but as I looked down in the valley of this previously, there were some gaps, and of course this one where I've got it squeezed together was the main one, and I think that's just where the screen comes together. But in order to ensure that valley, that we don't get more material leaking through there than we want, I had that closed off as best I can. So I'm going to get that cleaned up, and we'll work on putting things back together. All right, so after a lot of scrubbing with an old synthetic paintbrush, basically just in gasoline, I've got this as clean as I'm going to get it. There's still, you can see certain areas where there's still some varnish and dirt down in the valleys, but I could scrub for another day or two and probably not get all of that out. But for the most part, it's going to have good flow through it, so that's what matters. And I'm ready to go back and reinstall that. Okay, so now we're ready to come in and install our filter. You can see it basically drains from the center there. Didn't get it completely clean there. And then that pulls out into the pump right there. And so if we grab our filter, that basically just goes straight in all the way to the back. You'll notice this little notch right here, if I can show you. That needs to be to this side, and there's actually a pin on the lid right there that will hold that in place. And so it's important to remember which way the lid was facing. It's going to face basically like that. And what that does is that ensures that this drain hole here is at the bottom, right? So all the oil that comes out of the filter flows out and into this front area, like so. Now, one other part goes in here. It's this little spring down here. Shake off all the excess. And so that ensures that thing makes a bit of a seal towards the back, basically putting pressure on it. And going to put the lid on and attach it with the 4 12mm bolts that go in there. And we'll come back when it's done. And so now we have that installed. You can see how that bumps to that one side. And everything's tightened up. The O-ring could probably stand to be replaced on this, but it's still in pretty decent shape. At least grips the sides, so don't expect to have any leaks. Didn't last time that I could tell. I also, while I was in there, tightened, or just before I get out from under here, made sure I tightened up my drain plug here. So this center bolt right here is the drain plug for this thing. And I had just left that loose originally, but that would be really bad to forget to tighten that. So now we come to getting the hydraulics. So I need my new O-rings and need to clean these guys up a little bit. And we'll be ready to try to put the hydraulics back. I think I might have said that these were 12mm. They're actually 13mm bolts. As are the bolts that hold the universal joint in. Now, before I did anything else, I went back around and I tightened all of the bolts that hold the housing on. Remember, you're supposed to leave them loose in order to, actually let the gasket build up a little bit of thickness, but now I've Squeeze that down as tight as I can all the way around and have it held tight. And then the next step was to reinstall the universal joint. Basically putting the U-joint and the hydraulics back are all listed as part of the same step, but I think putting this in first makes sense. I cleaned all of the excess grease off of it that I could previously and installed it. Again, 13 millimeter bolts. This is a little challenging for using a ratchet on. I think when I broke them loose originally, I just used a regular box end wrench. In this case, I ended up, I have a U-joint feed for my ratchet that worked okay. But you can see, like, this scratch right here was where the head of the wrench hit. If I just tried to put the ratchet directly on, I couldn't get it on straight. And then I greased everything up real good. Tried to push as much of that old grease out as I could. You might be tempted to try to grease this thing before putting it in. I know I certainly was, but the issue there is that if you did that, these ends that need to bolt on, there's nothing holding those on. So those are just bare bearings. And if you squirt a bunch of grease in there, you'll pop those things right off and potentially mess up your bearings. So not something you want to do. Better to have it all bolted together than grease it, as I did here. So I had to go ahead and pull the bolt that holds those two pieces together so that way I could actually get to this O-ring that's in between these two pieces. And that way I can replace all of these. The big O-ring that was in that one is pretty hard at the moment. So overall, it's good to replace all of these. And so I'm going to pop that one out and fit new O-rings into all of this and bolt it on up to the chassis. Alright, so I have these parts all pretty nice and clean, as well as where they're going to mount to up here. You can see the deeper one there, and then the lower one here. And the O-rings for this ring, which you can see there's some sort of a check valve down there. So that O-ring and this O-ring appear to be the same size, and then you had the bigger one there. So we'll fish those out, get them installed, put a little bit of oil on them to make sure they seal nice, and button it up. Out of this kit, I went with number 115s there, so the next size up from the one I was initially looking at. It's basically making better contact toward the outside. Looks like all of these could stand to potentially be slightly thicker, but I think these will work. And then this is a 213 here. And like I say, it will compress. So I'm pretty sure it's going to hold well enough. Probably at least as well as the totally flattened one that I took out of there. So we will hope so. Just for comparison, here's the old one that I took out. And if I pull, it's a 213 that I ended up using in its place. You can see that as compressed as it is, it's just a little thicker. And pretty close. Like I say, if I had a bigger diameter one in this size, I would certainly use it. But as it is, my only other choice would be to go up to something like this and try to squeeze that into the slot, because pretty much nothing else gets close to that in terms of size. So that's what we got. I did just go ahead and take this up to the 214 size. I was just able to barely squeeze it in, and that should give a little more pressure when you go to compress it. So we'll give it a shot. All right, so we now have our hydraulic piping installed. And what we have left are these two hydraulic hoses that actually go back to the steering clutches to control the steering, or to provide the pressure for the steering. So the longer line goes to the hose at the bottom. You can see right there, just below the pipe. And that's the output from the pump. And that goes to the, what would be the left side if you're facing the front, right side facing the back. I don't know how much you'll be able to see. So that's that one on the right. The one on the left is going to be this shorter one, and that's the return that goes basically right in there. Now, the other side of this assembly, what all these hoses going to the front, that's actually just the oil cooler. So that's a simple loop that goes up to the front. And that valve that you saw inside is actually a bypass valve for this oil cooler. Now, in addition to making sure that all my fittings are clean and tightening up the two fittings of these hoses, I need to tighten the ones from the front, make sure that they didn't come loose on the piping there. Once I do that, I'm ready to start hooking up linkages and get this thing all adjusted and put some oil in it. So, coming along. So, those hose connections are actually 22 millimeter, and since my Craftsman set here only goes up to 20, I ended up having to use the 7/8 inch instead to loosen and tighten those. The hoses running down the side are even bigger. They're beyond 1 inch, so they're probably 26 or a little more. So I believe this will go out to about 35 millimeters, so presumably that'll work. There's no getting in there with a crescent wrench. There's just not enough space for a jaw, but I'm hoping one of these two can reach just to make sure those are tension. Now, my one concern, looking at the one hose there, you should be able to see some of the cracks. If I come over this way. So I don't know, the outer housing on this is going. You can see a few more cracks there. So who knows how long it will be before that thing springs a leak. But for now, we're going to put it back like it is. Now, to get that upper connector on, or off originally, that's why I actually ended up pulling loose the brake there for the clutch, simply because there's very little room to get in there. And even as it was, I was contorting and reaching from all sorts of different directions in order to get this thing done. But my hoses are back, and now I get to start hooking up the clutch pin there and the linkages for the clutch here. I'm hoping I don't really need to do any adjustment, but we'll see. What we want is, we don't want this thing riding on the bearing when the clutch pedal is up. And there's an adjustment guide, but basically you got two sets of linkages. And we'll see where we end up when I put all the parts back and finish that off. Alright, well, I reconnected my linkages, and I'd actually put the pin in on the brake as well, and then realized, well, with the brake pulling and clamping the shaft when the clutch was disengaged, I really had no way of telling for sure where or if the clutch was engaging or disengaging. As it is, I still can't tell, because so far I haven't been able to get it to truly come loose. That may just be that the plates are sticking. It's very hard to tell pushing on that pedal if I'm actually driving the clutch or not. The one thing I'm up against is somebody adjusted this in the past and basically took the nut that locks that side and stripped it. And so I cannot really adjust that side much beyond where it's at right now. I certainly can't push it in any further, which means I can't get a larger release on the clutch from that side. Now what I've done is I basically took the thing apart and drove this side in about as far as I could get it to go. And problem is I still can't tell that the clutch is loose, because if I take the shaft and try to rotate it, I see the fan move at the front. So I'm driving all the way back through the engine. What I'm going to have to try is to go ahead and put the oil in this thing and fire up the engine and determine if that clutch is actually releasing or not. Because if not, I'm probably going to have to buy a completely new one of these. I know I've got a tap set, but since this thing is reverse tapped, there's not much chance I'm going to be able to do anything with that. I'm just going to have to buy a new one. It's been more probably buying a tap set that could do it, and it's still got the stripped out section. So I don't know how available these are, but presumably I could find something else that would substitute if it came down to it. Worst case, I could potentially chop that off and lose that much of the length and still have enough to adjust, but we'll see. Now, as far as oil, it calls for SAE 10W. And good luck finding that anywhere. I think I found one place online and it was going to cost probably $100 to get it shipped. But if you do a little research, you'll find that ISO 32 is supposed to be the same as 10W SAE. And turns out that Home Depot sells Miles lubricants. You still have to order it, but they ship to home for free, and I think this was like 43 or 45 bucks, something like that. So basically, I just got to get 5 liters of this 5-gallon jug into the transmission or into the clutch. All right, so I got my 10W oil in, and still need to come back and check the level after running it for a while. It's interesting because that oil is basically, it's about the consistency of cooking oil. It's very, very thin. But that's what it's supposed to be. So, as far as this coupling, if you look now, you'll notice that the threads are way in and there is no nut on this side. That's simply because I came and I just chopped it off where the threads were stripped off of it. The nut was so badly cross-threaded there was no way to salvage it and use it, but not much space for it anyway. So, you know, I'd actually initially looked at could I swap the top and bottom linkages, but that bottom linkage is considerably longer, and since I needed to go shorter than I was, that wasn't going to work. But now I have it in, and it's basically adjusted where with the pedal all the way up, the thing is just about ready to disengage the clutch. You're supposed to have about an inch worth of travel on the pedal, and I would say we still have more than that before it actually starts disengaging the clutch. If I go any looser, I don't think we actually end up completely disengaging the clutch well, so I think this is where it needs to be. And the other thing I'll note is once I got it all running and adjusted, I needed to adjust my brake for this. You're supposed to, when you fully depress the clutch, it's supposed to stop within a couple of seconds, or a second and a half, or whatever. The other thing I had to do to get this in a reasonable range is the actual shaft there that is the linkage to the brake pedal itself, or the clutch pedal itself. I shortened that just a little bit so that this stuff was all ready to engage, so that, you know, as I push that clutch pedal down, it starts pulling the the bar almost immediately. So let me swing around to the other side. We'll fire this thing up and show you what happens. So one other word of warning: the first time you go to start this up after greasing that universal joint, make sure you stand back, because it's going to throw every bit of excess grease off of there that you've got, as I discovered when I started it. So let's see what happens here. Left to do is hook the spring up and cover the top and bottom, and this thing is back together and ready to run. Now, spring's going to be a little bit of a challenge because I still need to stretch it more than it is, and the way I put the little pieces of wood in there to take the tension off the spring, it's actually bending it away from where I need to hook now. So we'll see how that goes. It'll take me a little bit. Alright, so after fighting with it a bit, I was able to hook the spring back where it goes, and then grab my screwdriver and take all of my little spacers out of the spring to let it tension back completely. And with that, we are essentially done. Basically just need to put the covers on top and bottom. Bottom cover, they say use a big jack or whatever to lift it up, like a transmission jack. I obviously don't have that, and there'd be no good way of putting that under here anyway. So I plan to just use a strap or two and lift it up that way. Thing's pretty heavy. Of course, the real challenge is all the garbage that is on it from years of neglect and abuse. So my first challenge is going to be just to clean that up. And then, of course, the top goes on just with those bolts that are actually screwed in. The good news is, looking around, the only bolts I see laying around are the 6 bolts that hold the bottom on, and then these up here in their holes. So I think we got everything back where it came from. We'll come back later and see about finishing up the top and bottom. Several weeks later now, after a long business trip and a lot of bad weather, I finally have a decent day where I can finish the last couple of steps of reassembling this. So I've more or less cleaned all the gunk, the inch or two of dirt and leaves and branches and other scrap that was on here. Gave me several gallons in a bucket there. And in the process, I found myself a wrench, screwdriver I already had, so the wrench, some nuts, a O-ring, and a spare key. So now I have a spare key for my dozer, which I've needed, so that's cool. So now it's time to shove this thing up under there and get it pulled up. And of one little rain cloud coming over and dripping on me here. And looks like we'll probably be clear after this passes. Now I get to come back and finish this. So as you can see, what I've done is I've got it propped up on a couple of 2x4s running across. I could probably just crawl under there and lift it up, but what I'm going to do is use that strap and just attempt to pull it up into place. Trick will be keeping it balanced long enough to get it into place and not slide out. And then I can just push it the rest of the way and put the bolts in. So we'll give this a shot. Okay, so after lifting this up, I've got it all bolted back into place. It's basically 3 bolts down each side. One there, you can see by the strap, and one at the very end. Using a 7/8 wrench because I don't have a suitable metric. Over here, see the same thing on the other side. I ended up running a second strap under here just to help keep it from falling off the strap as I lifted it. But it's all into place. Now I just need to cover the oil cover here. Put that on and I'm done underneath. A lot less headroom under here now that this thing's in place. But I'll get it closed up and then put the cover on top. Top off my fluid and start playing. Alright, so after crawling up under here one last time with the 17mm socket, I now have the oil pan cover in place, and I am done underneath. I just have to put the foot plate on top, and we are done. Okay, so the top cover's back on, and the oil is right between the marks. So it's time to fire this thing up and make sure it moves. Well, so there we go. No more slipping clutch on my D20P-6. Now if I just had better traction than these mud tracks give me, and the engine a little more powerful and more weight and everything else so that I could move all this rock around easy, that would be awesome. But as is, it certainly does the job now, so I am quite happy that I have a new clutch. So I hope this video showing how to reassemble the clutch will be helpful for someone else who is trying to figure out how to replace the clutch on their unit.